So sneezing while infected probably means that you're sending out millions, if not billions, of some type of infectious particles. In this case, what we have here is a kid who's sneezing, and look at the way he's sneezing. First of all, he's sneezing like into his hand. If you're going to sneeze, the best way to sneeze is either into your arm or into your shirt. That way you're containing a lot of the droplets and the droplet nuclei, which can contain infectious particles. Now, if you're sneezing because it was some allergy and something got stuck, then that's different. But if you're sick, definitely contain your sneezes. Okay, so this kid needs to learn how to sneeze a little bit better in public, okay? But the point here is really talking about that at this point, what do we have here? We've got exit from the host, right? And so that, again, is how it can disseminate out of an organism. Okay, so this kid is sick. So the topic we're talking about right now is the chain of infectious disease. So the question is, what is the pathogen? And where did the kid get it from? Right? So this is the kinds of things we want to trace. So in this particular example, it came from a duck. So how do you figure that out? A kid was sneezing, it came from a duck, but the kid has not participated in interacting with the duck. So we know that there's some parts of the chain that are missing from this diagram. So what we're looking at here then is essentially the chain of infection from the duck. The woman loves her duck and fondles her duck, holds the duck, maybe even kisses the duck on the face, picks up a particular pathogen, and then loves on her kid. Right? She loves ducks, she loves her kid, and so essentially what she did is she got infected, or at least she's a carrier of whatever that was. And in this particular case, what is the pathogen we're talking about? Right? Look at it. What's the pathogen? Influenza. Okay, and so we'll talk about how influenza can cross the species barrier in another lecture. Okay, and that's important. Think about it, a virus that can infect an animal and can also infect a human. There's a lot of repercussions for that. So in this case, we call the duck the source of the pathogen. That is the initial organism that somebody picked up the virus from. Okay, and so for this person, the duck was the source. So the source is who you get or who the individual picks up the infectious particle or bacteria virus from. Okay? So the woman, what's the source? That's right, the source is the duck. Okay? How about the kid? Who's the source for the kid? That's right, the mom. So again, it's who you directly get it from. And so the source, essentially, is whoever you get it from, and in this case, the original source was the duck. And in this particular case, it's showing that the pathogen is what we've got here. So for a chain of infection to spread, you need the infectious agent, right, which is inside a source. You need some type of transmission process. In this case, what we're talking about is touching, and then probably touching your face. Very common for influenza, as we'll talk about later. You can either sneeze or cough and send it out and people get it, or you've been touching your face, you're infected, and then you touch a door handle, you touch things, other people touch it, and they touch their face. Touching your face is a very, very efficient way to get sick. You need to have some microbes on there, but microbes are everywhere. All right, so, and then the environment comes into play as well, which we'll talk about at some other point. Okay, so the kid, he was sneezing, and so he was exhibiting signs of illness. So if we look at this particular image here, right, where are we at here? Well, that kid is either in the illness stage or in the prodromal stage. So the vague general symptoms, right, are more along the lines of, I've got a body ache, you know, I'm tired, so there's malaise that's set in, or I've got a mild headache, or I just can't concentrate. Those are more of the vague general symptoms, because those happen often as a response of your body mounting an immune response. And so whether you're infected with influenza or Zika virus or certain types of bacterial infections, particularly certain types of bacterial infections, when you're just starting to come down to something, you don't know what it is right away. Okay, so what we have here then is we've got the incubation period, which is where you've picked up some type of infectious disease, and it is inside of you, and it is starting to duplicate, and essentially to the point where the numbers, which is the y-axis here, the number of microorganisms and the intensity of signs of symptoms, essentially it's still low. They're building up in your body, And then it gets to the point where you're starting to feel a little sick, which means that the microbe has disseminated. If it's influenza, that means it's typically in your lungs. Okay? It can also be in your upper respiratory tract. And then it gets to the point where, for example, if you're like me and you get influenza, you get hit hard. So for me, I see this just a little bit, I barely even notice it, and then the next day I'm just out. And then I'm in bed for several days. When I get hit by the flu, I get hard. And the only times that I've gotten the flu are the times that, oh, I've been so busy that I did not get vaccinated, which is kind of dumb for A, a microbiologist, and B, somebody who teaches and is around a lot of people. But anyway, I've learned my lesson. I'm not getting the flu anymore. I'm always getting vaccinated. So this is when the most severe symptoms are. And then your immune system and or anti-flu medication and or antibacterial or antiviral medication, and your immune system starts clearing out the pathogen, then your signs and symptoms start going away, and essentially gets to the point where you have convalescence. So these are the 5 stages after you get infected of many infectious diseases. Understand it, practice drawing it out, and know which one of these means. And so this incubation period, right, over here is also a telltale sign. So if you say, boy, this morning I got up and I'm not feeling too well, then the question is, okay, what are you infected by? And the different types of organisms have different incubation periods. And so if you look at this particular example, what we've got up here is influenza about a day. So it's pretty quick when you get infected to when you start feeling the signs and symptoms. Okay? Whereas others, for example, hepatitis B, the incubation period is 2 to 4 months, so a very long period of time. And AIDS was one that really allowed a lot of people to get infected right back in the 80s when this was first starting to spread. By the time epidemiologists figured out what was going on, that it was some type of virus, a lot of people had already been infected because A, the incubation period, and B, there were no diagnostic tests when it first came onto the scene. Okay, so you don't need to memorize any of these except for influenza, and we're going to talk about influenza in another lecture. Okay, and so going through that, and how do we get infected? Right, so the 4 major pathways are mucous membranes, skin, the parenteral route, and the placenta. And so the ones that I have as the stars are the main ones we're going to talk about in this class. So for the skin, that typically means broken skin. So you've been playing with your cat, you got tore open by some claws, you get some type of a cut or an abrasion, that opens you up to infection. And often, in the case of a cat scratch, that may have bacteria on the claw, which then causes an infection, right? Because you can get scratched, you can get cut and get no type of infection, partly because your immune system works so well, or if it does. And so the skin needs to be broken, whereas the mucous membranes, that is one where we're inhaling right now a lot of microbes. That's just the way it is. There's bacteria and viruses in the air, and we are breathing them in on a regular basis. When we talk about our immune system, we'll see why, by and large, we're good to go. And now, of course, we get food poisoning as well, but in terms of the most common, what we're talking about is there for the portals of entry. And the mucous membrane, after you drink it, well, they're in mucous membranes. So once they get in and you get sick, then how do they get out? Well, kind of the same way, right? So any type of secretions, right, are possible. Now, different disease agents only come out in certain types of secretions, right? So, for example, if you got a staph infection, on your skin, you're not going to be sneezing that out. That's not part of the mode of infection, right? For you to be sneezing out bacteria or viruses or fungus, they need to be lodged in somewhere your upper respiratory tract. Now that makes sense, right? Same with coughing or your lower respiratory tract or your upper respiratory tract. Okay, so however, things like MRSA for skin infections, right? You can transfer that from person to person, which is how some people pick it up in the community. Some people pick it up like on wrestling mats, things like that. And so, and we know that there's sexually transmitted diseases, etc. So this is just kind of an overview because we're going to be going through diseases, and for each disease we're going to be talking about how we get it, how it disseminates through the body, and how it exits. Okay, so where are they? Okay, so where are the bacteria? Now, first, there are opportunistic pathogens that normally don't cause disease, and some of these are on our skin. Okay, so we have a lot of bacteria on our skin, our intestines, and those are typically good for us, and we'll talk about that in another lecture, but let's go ahead and talk about some other examples. Okay, so the period of infectivity is the part where you actually are sick or not sick and you can infect other people. Okay, so if you can infect other people, you can be maybe an active carrier, right, which is where somebody is walking around, sneezing, they're sick, but they're so important, they need to go to work or go to school, right, and so that person, stay away from them. Convalescent carrier, oh, I'm over it. No worries, I feel fine. Well, there's plenty of diseases where you are still getting rid of certain bacteria or viruses, whether you're shedding them in your feces for some diseases or whether you've got just a little bit of a sniffle. Okay? Then there's a healthy carrier. For those of you that have heard of Typhoid Mary, Typhoid Mary essentially killed a bunch of people and got a lot of people sick because she was a cook and she did not exhibit any signs or symptoms, but she was releasing Salmonella typhi into the food that she was preparing for the people that employed her. Okay, so that's a very interesting story. If you don't know about it, we will cover that in the class. And then there's the incubator carrier who's incubating it. So remember the incubation period, which is here, right? So sometimes you can get loaded up with it, but you don't see signs and symptoms yet. And so different diseases will dictate different behaviors and modes of escape. Okay? So the reservoir is essentially the location where it's normally found outside of somebody getting sick. Okay? And so that's because most pathogens, for example, on this clicker that I'm holding, there's microbes on it, but if you just let it sit for a while, a lot of them will dehydrate and they will die. Okay? So where are the bacteria coming from other than people, other than animals? Well, the environment. Okay, so what we see here is that the environment can hold them. So water, such as cholera. Cholera is a prime example of a waterborne disease. Human carriers, okay, and so human carriers, for example, we'll see influenza, although it really doesn't ramp up in the northern hemisphere until winter, right, until the winter months. People have the flu throughout the entire year, so it's endemic, okay? And then animal reservoirs, and for example, animal reservoirs, well, we'll talk about specific examples of that as well. Okay, so basically, animal reservoirs, birds, okay, if we're talking about West Nile virus, birds, mosquitoes, okay? Other types of diseases are in ticks, they can be in deer, right? And then if they find a way to get transmitted to humans, that's how they get to you, okay? So, let's see, I think we've covered all of that already. And so back to the chain of infectious disease, this particular transmission to the host, transmission, susceptibility, and then transmission, okay? In this particular case, what we were looking at is an airborne disease, but that's obviously not the only types of diseases we have. And so if we look at this, what we see is that there's two general categories, that is direct transmission and indirect transmission. So direct transmission, of course, we've got touching, we've got kissing, right? That's intimate and you are one-on-one or one-on multiples, whatever. Sexual intercourse, right? Again, a transfer of fluids, right? That's key. Other contact, such as drug users getting infected with hepatitis C, getting infected with HIV, and then the direct transmission in terms of this one down here, this airborne, okay? So how is that direct? If it's airborne, well, what we're talking about, so look at this. I love these pictures. So this is an explosion of mucus from sneezing. And so direct contact, short distance like this, so like if I was standing right there and that person just sneezed all in my face, right? First I'd want to punch him in the stomach, but I wouldn't, unless they did it on purpose maybe. Because that, there's just no need for that. But that would be a lot of mucus, right, that contains a lot of viruses in it. However, so that's direct if it's really close and it's from that person directly to you, and that's the key. That person just assaulted me with those fluids, okay? However, the reason that over an indirect transmission we also have airborne, and we've got droplets over that, is because what happens is some of these droplets, they aren't the big kinds that will just go a couple feet and land on the ground or splatter my face. Some of them are very, very tiny to the point where they can float around in the air for days. Now, it depends on the humidity level, but in a high humid environment, these little droplets, which in the case of influenza, can have between 3, 10, maybe 100 viruses in them, are just floating around, ready to just kind of get sucked up into somebody's nose and thereby infect them. So in the case of sneezes, that's kind of double duty. That can infect people through direct transmission with these droplets, as well as indirect through the droplet nuclei that are then scattered around. Okay? And later on in the course, we'll talk about getting infected while being on an international flight if somebody's sneezing or coughing. Okay? So a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory. Vehicle-borne means that it's on something. Right? Water, contaminated food, right? You just ate this chicken that was contaminated, and then you get sick, and you know it came from the chicken. And so then the vector-borne are, here's a couple of culprits right there. I love this picture. Look at that tick, just totally embedded. Okay, and we'll talk about ticks and how they can have bacteria living in their salivary glands so that when they're feeding on their blood meal that is inside you, they're essentially releasing these bacteria into your bloodstream, right? And you didn't even know they were there because when they started burrowing into your skin, they released an analgesic and kind of numbed it a little bit so you didn't notice the pain. Okay, and mosquitoes, West Nile virus, Zika virus, dengue virus, mosquitoes are clear culprits in vector-borne. So these are how it's transmitted, right? So have definitely a good handle on these different modes. If you get a hypothetical example or a real example on a test or a quiz, be able to know whether it is direct or indirect, or whether it is vector-borne, or whether it is airborne, etc. So if I give you a scenario, right, you can say, yes, it came from an animal, so I know it's vector-borne, right? And you know, this type of picture just breaks my heart. The hundreds of millions of people that do not have clean water and are routinely infected by infectious agents is, you know, in my opinion, bordering on a crime in some of these countries. It would be relatively easy in terms of money spent worldwide to make sure that people have clean drinking water. Okay, and so this is just showing this kid getting water from this highly contaminated stream. And so we'll talk about waterborne diseases. We'll talk about a little bit about third world countries and the challenges that they face when it comes to these types of diseases. Okay. However, we won't spend a huge amount of time in this course because there's a lot to cover, and the course really is directed towards understanding some of the history, a lot of the epidemiology, antibiotic resistance, how diseases are caused. And since there's so many diseases in the US that we need to cover, other diseases that are not as prevalent in our country, we just won't cover. But by the end of the class, you will certainly be able to look at any disease that we didn't cover in this class and learn about it very, very quickly. And so that's the power of learning the fundamentals and learning how to apply it to new information. So this right here essentially is just a list of terms, which I'm not going to go over. Know these. You probably, as nurses, already know the majority of these terms, but memorize them, know them. You may have to provide a definition or do some kind of matching, but we're not going to go over them, but you are definitely responsible for them. And so that pretty much covers our transmission lecture, okay? And what you'll see is that these topics will be included in multiple lectures as we need them for each particular type of disease.